The dust was a thin grey layer on the platform, blending with the coal dust and the dry prairie wind. Stagecoaches and wagons were lined up at the Canyon Ridge Railroad station, men in leather hats arguing and shoving, grabbing crates and bales. Between them stood a woman. She was not noticed. Ellen Winslow came from the East, 38 years old, an age that some called experienced and others called too late. She had one travelling bag, an old suitcase, and a letter which she held as if it held her very destiny. No one approached. She waited. 10, 15 minutes passed. People were leaving, the cart was leaving, the stablemen were whistling. Ellen stood as if pressed into the ground, looking into the faces of the passing men. She was looking for one, a tall, grey-haired man named Daniel Frost. It was he who had written that letter, who had not promised love, but who had promised to accept her as she was. But no one came. She walked down the dusty street to the center of the town. It was different here than at home in Virginia. The trees were sparse, the heat as dense as a shroud, and every glance from the men was like a stabbing. Some looked past her, others looked at her with wonder, as if she were a visitor from the past. She paused at the market stall, hoping for a look of understanding. The clerk brushed dust off the counter and didn't even say hello. A girl standing nearby waved at Ellen, but her mother pulled her away and led her away. Her fingers gripped the letter tightly. She already knew those lines by heart. I'm lonely. You're not young, but I think you're smart. You know how to run a household. I need someone around me. If you're willing, come here. Sincerely, D. Frost. The letter came after a long correspondence, 8 months of hopes, polite questions, and quiet confessions. No one before him had ever written to her so sincerely. No one had called her Dear Ellen. But it seemed different now. At night, in a cheap room above the tavern, Ellen lay on a narrow bunk without undressing. The room smelled of beer and sweat. Drunken gamblers shouted behind the wall. She stared at the ceiling, rereading the last letter from Daniel over and over. He'd written that he'd be waiting at the station. He'd said she shouldn't worry, that he didn't mind age. It's been 10 hours since he arrived. Maybe he changed his mind. Maybe he saw her from a distance and decided to leave without explaining himself. It's happened before. A man in Montana had simply sent a note. Didn't expect you to be so mature. He never responded again. But now she was here, far from home, no money, no return ticket. And yet, in spite of her fatigue, anxiety, and heat, there was no despair in her gaze. Only something else, a stubborn determination born in the heart of a woman who had been brought to her knees more than once, but who had always risen. Before she crossed the country in a wagon, Ellen Winslow had lived in a small town in the East, where everyone knew each other and every woman over 40 became either a shadow of her family or a ghost in the church. She had been a widow for over a decade. Her husband had died of fever when she was 41. They had no children. For the first few years after his death, Ellen lived as if in semi-reflection. Her days were filled with knitting, baking, reading scripture, and occasional visits. She did not complain. She had been raised to be a woman of duty, humble, patient, grateful. But each year the loneliness grew thicker, like the frost covering the windows in January. Sometimes on the bench outside the church, she caught glimpses of young girls chatting merrily about suitors, and she felt awkward, as if she were intruding into someone else's life. Her friends were either long married or, like her, hushed in their loneliness, but preferred not to talk about it. Her house was quiet, too quiet. At the fair, where she sold jam and embroidery, men hardly ever looked at her. Once she heard a local girl whisper to a friend, she used to have beautiful eyes. When Ellen turned 52, she sat by the window with a letter from the newspaper. It was the old column, Women from the West Looking for Brides. She read it first out of curiosity, then again and again, until the words rang inside her like a challenge. It said, "A widow with household skills, capable of honesty and support, is invited to Arizona for possible marriage. Age is no barrier if the heart is open." Ellen did not immediately decide to reply. She pondered the letter for 3 weeks. Then she wrote a line, then another, then burned the paper. On the third attempt she sent it, trembling, praying, and with a hope she dared not admit. The answer came 2 weeks later. A man named Daniel Frost, a widower, a former farmer now living in Canyon Ridge. He was 5 years older than her, thoughtful, not verbose. His letters were not lush, but there was honesty in every line. He wrote about his loneliness, about how hard it was to live alone, how hard it was to wake up in a house where no one said good morning. He wrote, "I am not looking for passion. I'm looking for a companion, a woman who will understand that warmth can be found without fire." With each letter, Ellen found herself smiling more and more as she read his lines. She told him about her garden, about recipes for peaches, about snow in January. He'd write back about dusty roads, mules, cacti on the doorstep. These letters became her morning ritual. She woke up for them. One day he wrote, "If you decide to come, I will meet you at the station. I don't know what you look like, but I think you are a person with whom I could live the rest of my days in peace and understanding." Ellen closed the reply envelope and hesitated no longer. She sold the house for half its value, left all the furniture to the neighbors, donated the books to the library. She took only 2 dresses, a traveling Bible, a china box, a gift from her mother, and Daniel's letter. She didn't know what lay ahead, but she did know that to stay was to disappear. On the 3rd day after arriving at Canyon Ridge, Ellen heard the voice of the hotel receptionist. "You have a visitor, ma'am. A man, gave his name, Daniel Frost, waiting out front." She froze as the words cut through the air. He came. Late, but he had come. Ellen threw on her shawl and walked quickly out of the room. Her heart was pounding like a young girl's, though she tried to keep her countenance calm. He stood at the entrance, leaning on his cane, slouching, with his broad-brimmed hat in his hands. His hair was almost completely grey, his eyes as grey as the sky before a rainstorm. He looked tired and wary. "Minus Miss Winslow?" he asked, not smiling. "Yes," she nodded. "Hello, Mr. Frost." He nodded silently, his eyes sliding over her face, her clothes, her figure. Ellen noticed the tightness of his fingers on his cane. It was a look she knew. It was almost invisible, but it was there nonetheless. The look of a man disappointed from the first second. "I'm sorry I didn't meet you at the train. Work, ... He didn't finish the sentence. "I understand," she replied softly. There was a pause. "I thought," he began, "maybe you could walk with me to the farm. I'll show you the place, and then we'll decide what to do." Ellen nodded. They left the hotel, walked down the street where the dust was rising under their boots. All the way he hardly spoke at all. Occasionally he dropped short phrases about the weather, about the drought, about the city in which nothing changes. He didn't ask how she'd gotten there, didn't ask if she needed anything. He just walked beside her as if she were a stranger. The farm was modest. A 2-room house, a tiny barn, a chicken pen. The ground was parched, the grass burned out, but everything was neat and tidy. There was a crocheted net of corn on the porch. He pointed to the door. "Here. This is where I live. Sometimes an assistant comes by, rarely. I manage on my own." Ellen entered the house. Inside, it smelled of wood, old soap, and loneliness. Everything said that no one had laughed here in a long time. She saw a nail against the wall and hung her shawl on it. "Thank you for coming after all," she said. "I was a little afraid you'd changed your mind." Daniel looked at her for a long moment. Then he lowered his eyes. "I didn't expect," he began, and fell silent. Ellen straightened up. "Which is what?" "You're older than I thought," he said, almost in a whisper. "I didn't mean to offend you. It's just, it was different in the letters. I didn't think you'd look like this." She stood like a stumbling block. None of the words were harsh, but each cut sharper than a blade. She nodded, as if it were entirely expected. "I understand," she said. "We all sound younger in letters." He averted his gaze as if ashamed, but still didn't approach her. I still need to think about it, he muttered. This is not what I expected. You're a worthy woman, but I don't know if we're right for each other. Ellen picked up her shawl from the wall. Thank you for your honesty, Mr. Frost. I need to think about it too. She walked out without slamming the door. The sun was on the porch. It was hot, but she was cold. The wedding was quiet. No flowers, no music, no guests. Just him, her, and a witness from the local grocery store, unshaven in a shabby vest. Ellen stood with a straight back, hands clenched into a knot of fingers. Daniel looked glum, as if he was signing a promissory note, not swearing allegiance. The priest read the words without much inspiration, as if in a hurry to get back to his lunch. Ellen still hoped to hear something. A voice, a look, a hint of acceptance. But Daniel barely looked at her. Consider yourself under a roof now, he said briefly when they got home. There's a room for you in the annex. The house is mine, the order is mine. Stay out of my business. It's not, he stammered, it's not for love. You're here for name and decorum. Understand? Yes, Ellen answered calmly, but something inside her trembled. She knew what she was getting into, but it still hurt to hear it. The outhouse was cramped, with a low ceiling and a single window looking into the stable. In the corner was a narrow bed, an old coat rack, and a jug with a cracked handle. No curtains, no coziness. But it was her corner, and her freedom, the kind of freedom a woman of 50 could afford. Daniel's son, an 8-year-old boy named Johnny, was wary of Ellen at first. He hid around corners, watched from the sidelines, didn't answer her greetings. Sometimes he ran past her as if she were a ghost, a stranger who would soon disappear. For the first time, Ellen simply lived by the established rules. She scrubbed floors, cooked meals, folded laundry neatly. Daniel barely spoke to her, nodding occasionally at a broken fence or a burst trough. One night, when a thunderstorm broke, Johnny, frightened, came to her outhouse. He stood on the doorstep, wet, his lips trembling. Dad said the lightning bolts were punishment. I think it's just the sky that can't contain its feelings. Ellen smiled and handed him a blanket. Sometimes you have to warm up to feel better. The boy lay on the floor by her bed, curled up in a ball. In the morning he left without a word, but in the evening he left an apple by the door. That was the first sign. Over time he began to come closer, asking questions. Can you bake a cake? Tell me about trains. Did you have a house of your own? Ellen answered softly, not intrusively, as if she were afraid of spoiling this thin thread. Daniel noticed everything, but didn't comment. He was reserved, almost cold. Sometimes his eyes caught hers, but it was like he was fighting something inside. A couple weeks later, Ellen dared to ask, Can I plant a garden? Here, on the side of the house. I've seen it. It's good soil. Why? He asked incredulously. I just want something to grow here. He didn't say anything, just shrugged. Ellen took that as a yes. What was going on wasn't a marriage. It was a contract, a deal. But Ellen didn't feel like a victim. She knew it took time for something to grow and care. First, she lived in a hotel. Then she lived in the laundry room, helping with the food. And after a week, to Daniel's own surprise, Ellen returned to his house, not as a guest, as a temporary lodger. You still have an empty room, she said. I'm not imposing. I'll just clean and help out. You'll see what happens from there. He only shrugged and relented. Her days found a rhythm. She got up before dawn, dusted, cooked simple oatmeal, watered the sparse bushes outside the house. Later, she borrowed old boards from a market vendor, old crates that were going to be burned. She made beds out of them, with skewed edges, but sturdy. In the soil, she planted bulbs she'd found for 5 cents from a neighbor. Nothing's going to grow here, Daniel said as he walked past. The ground is as hard as a soul. We'll see, she answered without looking at him. Sometimes, if you water and talk to her, even the soul starts to sprout. He hummed, but fell silent. Every evening Ellen darned and sewed. On the veranda, in a chair with rickety legs, she pulled old shirts out of the trunk, ripped them open, sewed them back together. collecting fabric scraps from her neighbors, asking the children for old pillowcases. From this, a quilt began to emerge, big, colorful, as if from hundreds of other people's stories. She called it her new skin, because she had to leave the old one behind. Soon she was fixing a chair, then another. She replaced nails, sanded the boards, covered them with oil. The room began to breathe. The house began to sound different. One day, as Ellen was walking to the shop, Mrs. Wharton, the blacksmith's wife, a full woman with a loud voice, approached her. "You're the one from the East, aren't you, Ellen?" "Yes," she smiled. "Are you good at sewing?" The women and I were thinking of having a little fair in the square. Jams, blankets, baked goods. It's all manly, but we'd like to have a party. Are you in? Ellen nodded, not immediately. But then she said, Sure. I have a recipe for cherry pie. It's an old Virginia one. The fair was noisy, as it was for Canyon Ridge. Knitted doilies, jars of pickles, blankets on wooden tables. Children ran around. Men came up to sniff, but soon retreated to the beer. The women, on the contrary, laughed, discussed, praised Ellen for the pie. "You taste like my grandmother," said one. "And those stitches on the quilt, did you embroider them yourself?" admired another. Ellen laughed and felt a lightness rise in her chest that had almost been forgotten. She was noticed, not as an old comer, but as a craftswoman, as a woman with warmth. Daniel stood at the edge of the fairgrounds. He watched from the shadows, not approaching. His gaze was heavy, his face stony. When Ellen got home later than usual, he was already sitting on the veranda sipping coffee. "Did you have fun?" he asked sharply. "A little," she replied calmly as she walked past. "I saw you out there, laughing, selling pies. Women respect you now, huh?" "Just grateful for the warm pie," Ellen shrugged. "You're doing all this to stay." She stopped. "I'm doing this so I don't disappear." He turned away. Something sharp flashed across his face. Not anger, no. More like irritated jealousy. Not of men, but of the fact that she could live even where he'd already given up. Her garden was slowly sprouting, and so did he. The fair was already coming to an end. In the late afternoon, the sky was a copper glow. The wind ruffled the ribbons on the stalls, and children ran around with gingerbread in their hands. Ellen gathered up the leftovers, carefully folding the tablecloth, packing the unsold jars of cherry jam. That's when he came up. "Is this your pie?" he asked softly, pointing to the empty mold. Ellen looked up. In front of her stood a tall man in his 50s, broad-shouldered, his hair slightly curly, with graying at the temples. In his hands was a worn hat. He spoke slowly, but not uncertainly. His eyes were the color of smoky amber. "Yes, mine," she said. "Cherry with cinnamon and cloves." He nodded. "It smelled like childhood. My mother used to make it. It was a long time ago." She smiled. There was something odd about the way he looked. No pressure, no evaluation, just seeing her. "Thomas Gray," he introduced himself. "I have a sawmill on the northern edge. I don't suppose we've met." "Ellen Marsh. I'm recently here." "I can see that," he said, with a slight chuckle. "It's like you've brought a piece of another world with you." She didn't know why she stayed to talk. They talked about books. He mentioned that he still had his wife's library, including Emily Dickinson's poems. "Dickinson?" she wondered. "Here?" "My wife loved it. Sometimes I reread it. I don't understand half of it, but some of it resonates. 'Hope is a feathered creature that in the soul sings without words,'" she quoted. He looked at her in silence, and there was more than words in that silence. The next night, he stopped by her house, unexpectedly, with a loaf of bread and a jar of honey. "It's to pay for the pie," he said, "and to talk." Daniel met him with a stone face. "We're having dinner," he cut off. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything," Thomas said calmly. "I don't think so," Daniel muttered. But he didn't. Ellen set the table, adding a plate. Braised beans, bread, some cheese. The evening was strange, tense, like a taut bowstring. Thomas asked about Virginia, about recipes, about books, Ellen answered. Daniel sat in silence, picking at his food. When Thomas got up to leave, he lingered on the threshold. You have a peaceful home. If you want, you can come to our sawmill. Sometimes books need to be read in the right quiet. He nodded to Ellen and left. After dinner, Daniel went outside, slamming the door sharply. She followed him. What's wrong with you? Don't you get it? He hissed. He's a widower, rich, respects books, appreciates pies. His beard isn't as shaggy as mine. Are you jealous? Me? He grinned, but too wickedly. I just don't like it when someone makes a spectacle of themselves under my nose. Under your nose? Ellen came closer. Daniel, I'm not a thing. I'm not a dog. And I didn't ask for your protection. He wanted to say something, but held back. His chest heaved heavily. She looked at him long and calmly. He looked away. Have a good night, she said, and went back into the house. Later, lying in bed, she thought of Thomas. Not as a knight, not as a savior, but as a man she could just talk to, without expectations, without a game. He looked at her as an equal, and that spark, barely perceptible, was real. It was raining for the second day. The morning was grey, heavy, and everything seemed to be covered with a pall of moping. The ground had crumbled, and the paths were a viscous mush. Ellen was pulling on her cloak, about to go to the shop on the outskirts to get cloth. She was about to climb onto the cart when a voice came from behind her. Him again? She turned around. Daniel stood under the awning, hands in his pockets, shoulders tense. What do you mean? You're going to Thomas, he said. You've had enough of the shops. It's written all over your face where you're going. She froze. Anger was rising in her chest, timid at first, like a spark, then hot, almost liberating. I'm going for the fabric, she said quietly but firmly. And even if you were, it's none of your business. He stepped closer. Not mine. You bear my last name, Ellen. You live in my house. You eat at my table. She looked into his eyes. Suddenly, something inside her clicked. I am not your property, even if I bear your surname, she said. He recoiled as if struck. You've changed, he muttered, ever since he showed up. No, Daniel, she answered. I started to remember who I was. The cart was stuck after a quarter of a mile. The wheels sank into the clay, and the horse snorted alarmingly. Ellen jumped down and tried to push, but in vain. The mud sucked up like bog sludge. Allow me, came a voice from behind. Thomas. He walked over without asking too much. He rolled up his sleeves and stood beside him. They pushed the wagon together, and after a few jerks, the wheels came free. He didn't let go of her hand right away. The touch was warm, sure. Thank you, she whispered. He nodded. A few moments of silence. No words, no movement, just the squelch of water somewhere in the field and the closeness of two bodies. Is everything all right? He asked, looking into my eyes. Not really, but I think I'm finally going where I need to go, she replied. He touched her elbow gently, not a hint of demand, only encouragement. She sensed she didn't have to make excuses for breathing around him. When she got home, Daniel was already waiting, silently. The fire crackled in the fireplace, rain, falling outside the windows. He didn't ask where she'd been. It's all wrong for you, isn't it? He said suddenly. I'm not educated, I'm not affectionate. I don't read books, but I gave you a roof. I gave you a name. You gave me a pact, Daniel, she said calmly. But you didn't give me yourself. You don't see me as a person. Only a role, a housekeeper, a woman who should be grateful. He clenched his fists. I didn't realize you needed more. I didn't even know, until I started breathing. At night, she lay awake. She watched the rain, listened to it dripping down the windowsill. Everything was changing inside. It hurt, released. She belonged to no one. And finally, she belonged to herself. The sun seemed especially warm after the rain. The air was saturated with the scents of damp earth and herbs that had barely begun to break through the wet clay. Ellen was tending the garden, pruning bushes, marking out where the flower beds would be in the spring. The wicket gate creaked. She raised her head. Thomas. He walked slowly, his head slightly tilted. He was holding a bundle neatly tied with a linen ribbon. He stopped at the hedge, as if hesitating to enter without an invitation. "May I?" he asked, nodding at the garden. She nodded. He entered, stepped closer, and held out the bundle. "They're seeds, uncommon. Cornflowers, phlox, night violet. You said you love a flowering garden." Ellen carefully unwrapped the cloth. Small canvas bags, each with a handwritten inscription. She ran her fingers over the letters. "You remember," she whispered. "I was listening," he replied simply. They were standing side by side, shoulder to shoulder. There was no need to say anything. It was all there in that gesture. Since then, he's been showing up more often. Not every day. No pressure, no requests. Just around, if he needed to fix the gate, bring firewood, pull up the roof on the shed. He knew when to be silent and when to say one thing, something simple, to the point. One day she dropped a basket of laundry, her hands shaking after an argument with Daniel in which he had called her old, stale, and tedious. Thomas picked up the towels, dusted them off, helped her gather them up. "You are not old," he said, quietly but firmly. "You are an aged wine. Not every man is worthy of you." Her breath hitched. She sat down on the bench. He crouched beside her, not touching. "Why are you like this?" she whispered. He shrugged. "Because that's who you are. People think a woman's worth is in her youth, but with age comes true beauty, the kind that goes deeper than skin." She closed her eyes. She closed her eyes, not out of fatigue, not because her heart was pounding too loudly. When he left that evening, she stayed in the garden, watching the evening sun slip over the back of the bench. On her lap lay a bundle of seeds. She took one bag, labeled Night Violet, and held it to her chest. He didn't demand anything. He didn't rush me. He didn't reprimand. And it was with that she was beginning to truly love him. It had been raining all day, as if the sky had decided to flood the earth. The clouds gathered into a leaden blanket, leaving the town in grey shadows. Ellen was approaching the house when she heard loud voices. It was Daniel. He was standing on the porch, cursing, yelling, and all she could make out were what sounded like accusations. Thomas. He was there too, but he stood in the shadows, not interfering. "You think I don't know what you're building out there in that garden?" Daniel staggered out of the house. He was drunk, eyes blazing furiously. "You're seeing him, aren't you?" Ellen took a step forward, trying to reassure him. "Daniel, you're drunk," she said quietly. "We were just talking. It's not what you think." "Not what I think?" He jumped at her, his face twisted with anger. "You're my wife, and you're going out with this man?" Thomas stood nearby like a stone, motionless, but there was a tinge of pain in his eyes. "He's not a man. He's not my husband, Daniel," Ellen replied, clenching her fists. She felt something inside her break. "He doesn't deserve your insults." Daniel, in response, only laughed, but the laughter was somehow hysterical. "You've decided you can do whatever you want, haven't you?" His voice became even louder, and the words poured out like a cornucopia. "You want him? Go to him. You want him? Go to him. Leave me alone." He pushed her aside, at which point Thomas couldn't stand it. "Don't touch her," he said calmly, but there was a threat in his voice. Daniel turned and walked toward him. A long moment of silence, then a jerk. They collided. A rough scramble. Thomas was strong, but he didn't retaliate with roughness. He simply held Daniel back, preventing him from getting to him. He knew fighting wouldn't help, but the rage in Daniel's eyes was too great to stop it. Ellen stepped between them. Her face was calm, but there was a storm raging inside. She could feel her heart breaking with pain, but she said it nonetheless. "Stop it, both of you. It's over." Daniel stopped when he heard her words. He looked at her with hatred, and then at Thomas. He raised his hand as if he wanted to say something, but instead he just exhaled. "If you want to be with him, go away. Sit with him in that garden of yours and don't come back." Ellen seemed unable to breathe. Daniel's words cut through her, but she couldn't let her head drop. She took a slow step back and looked back at Thomas, standing in silent expectation. Without words, she realized what needed to be done. Night was already falling. Ellen took her old suitcase, put a few things in it, and went out on the porch, where the rain poured down on the ground like a bucket. Thomas followed her, but said nothing. He simply walked beside her, wordlessly, silently accepting her choice. Ellen felt his presence, as if he were part of her breath. The wind blew hard in her face, but she walked onward, down the wet path that led to Thomas's house. The rain rumbled in her ears, but inside she was silent. Ellen walked without looking back. She knew she could no longer stay there, among the strangers, among the pain that followed her like an inexorable weight. Thomas was silent again, but his warm gaze was sure. He wasn't asking her for a decision. He was just there for her. Thomas opened the door for Ellen. Behind her was a warm house, an atmosphere of cozy solitude, with the smell of freshly baked bread and the slight crackle of a fireplace. He stood on the threshold, leaning forward slightly, his gaze soft and filled with understanding. "I'm not asking," he said quietly but firmly. "I'm just waiting for you to choose." Ellen felt her heart freeze for a moment. He didn't rush her, didn't demand, didn't create tension. Thomas was patient, and his words were full of respect. It was a revelation to her. She was not just a woman in search of salvation. She was an equal, and her choices were important to him. She gazed into his face, where there was not a shadow of impatience. In his eyes she saw only respect, a willingness to support her when she was ready. And suddenly, Ellen realized that she wasn't afraid to choose. Her world had long ago turned upside down, and she was no longer the woman who was afraid of her desires. She wasn't looking for salvation, but for love. Real, unconditional love. She stepped into the house, feeling the warm air and smells surround her as if the house were her own. It became a symbol not only of safety, but of a new beginning. Thomas closed the door behind her, and she felt the door close not only her past, but all doubts. He walked over to her, taking his time, and leaned in to kiss her. It wasn't a passionate kiss like the ones she'd known before. It was more than that, some kind of reassurance that they were here, together, and this place was her home. The kiss was full of softness, firmness in the decision, and hope for the future. It was the moment she realized there was no doubt. It was the certainty that she had finally found a place where she was valued and loved for who she was. A year has passed. Ellen and Thomas, despite all the hardships they had endured, had managed to build not only a home, but their lives. Their garden was now green and blooming, a reflection of the care and time they had put into every corner of this space. They spent warm evenings sitting by the porch, enjoying the view of their own little corner of happiness. It was just like them, filled with life, peace of mind, and confidence in the future. Ellen sat on an old armchair, journal in hand, and wrote a few lines reflecting what she had realized in the last few months. She paused, reread her words several times, and then, as if putting the pen away, sighed. "I was just over 50 when I finally realized age is not a deadline, but a time to blossom. I'm not getting old. I'm becoming the person I was meant to be." Behind her, in the light of the setting sun, Thomas stood, his warm gaze fixed on her, and in his eyes was everything: love, care, understanding. He walked over, touching her shoulder lightly, and she felt all the heaviness of the past fade away. He knew they weren't just words. They were her words about accepting her life, her uniqueness, and all of her experiences. She had accepted herself. At that moment, a voiceover, soft and soothing, said, "She came for a marriage of convenience, but found a love that can't be bought." The words were simple, but they contained all the depth of the story. Ellen had not only found love, she had learned to live in harmony with herself, and now her life was what she had dreamed of, full, rich, and sincere. It had been a long time, but every day was now a new opportunity for her to blossom.